Hello, my name's Professor Claire Collins, and I'd like to welcome you today to another of our Leadership Gems interviews from the Henley Centre for Leadership. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dame Lynne Owens, the recently former Director General of the National Crime Agency. So Lynne, if we could just start by asking, when did you first know that what you were doing was leadership?
So I think I first realised that not long after I joined policing. So I joined policing in a long while ago now. So in 1989, and I was a police constable. And I think one of the things that stands policing apart from many other professions is from immediately you hit the first start of your career on the streets, you are making leadership decisions in the way they affect the lives of members of the public. So unlike other professions, in many ways, you are leading from the very first day of your career, which for a 21-year-old is quite a big deal.
It is, really. And so how has leadership changed for you as you've moved through the ranks?
Well, of course, I spent just about 4 years as a police constable, so I felt like I was leading in communities. But then I took leadership roles within policing, ending up as the Director General of the National Crime Agency. And of course, what happens then is your responsibilities change. So I've always said I'm motivated by two things. The first is the leadership and service I provide to the public, and secondly, the leadership I provide to those that I'm privileged to lead.
That makes sense, and that leads me really well onto my second question. So, in the Henley Centre for Leadership, we often use the phrase "leadership for what." So, in your world, what's your leadership been for? What's been your goal in terms of leadership?
So, my goal, whether it be as a police constable or as a Director General of the National Crime Agency, is to protect the public. You're leading teams of people to ensure the UK, its citizens, its communities, its businesses are safe. But that slightly undersells it, because you have a secondary responsibility too, and that is to the people that you lead, and making sure that you are spotting and nurturing talented people, you're coaching, you're mentoring them, you're bringing them on and through. You're spotting those who are at the worst end of the spectrum, potentially corrupt or lazy or unprofessional, and ensuring that actually they get dealt with appropriately too. But the vast majority of people that I have worked with have just needed the very best leadership, in which you're clear about the things you want them to do, you're setting them in the right direction, but you're making them feel empowered and valued, and that they know they have a good career ahead of them too.
And in that sense, policing is like any other organisation. You've got the good, the bad, you've got to lead those people appropriately. But do you feel that there are differences in policing from, say, a private sector organisation?
I think the big thing about policing is that in policing you police with consent of the communities. It's one of the things that makes the UK policing model very different to any other model across the world. Policing in this country, we are largely unarmed still. And we require citizens to tell us when they're in trouble, to provide intelligence, to come to a police officer's aid when they need it. So I think that does make the requirement for a very different model of leadership, because policing needs to be trusted. The citizens of this country need to have confidence in police officers and the police staff that support them.
That's great, thank you. And in terms of, I'm probably thinking about your more senior leadership roles, who do you do leadership with? Who are the people around you that you would share that leadership with?
Well, I think that is one of the things that actually changes the more senior you get. So you have your own team, so you have people that you work alongside, and in many instances those are sort of line management relationships with a two-way responsibility to one another. But actually, equally importantly, you need a leadership relationship with lots of other stakeholders, and the National Crime Agency, that was immense. One of the things that makes the National Crime Agency just such a very special organisation is it has a statutory responsibility to lead the UK's fight to cut serious and organised crime. So you have a responsibility to run your own organisation, but you also need to encourage, leverage others to do work for you too. And I think everybody would expect that to be the 43 police forces of England and Wales, plus Police Scotland, plus the Police Service of Northern Ireland, plus British Transport Police, plus others. But actually it's far wider than that. It's government departments, it's the intelligence agencies, really critical partners in the public sector. It's a lot of the private sector with the increase of focus on cybercrime, cyber-enabled crime, illicit finance, fraud. Actually, the relationship with the private sector is very, very important. And the voluntary sector too. When you look at the rise of child abuse in this country, actually work very closely with lots of the charity sector to help support and nurture victims.
And so from your point of view, how did you feel that your leadership had to change from where you started? As you say, you've got a responsibility for the community, for the public that you serve. As you move along, you've got then line responsibility for people, but at the National Crime Agency, it's global, really,
Yes.
and very intensely in the UK, a multidisciplinary role.
Yes.
From your experience, how did things change, and how did you have to change
Yes.
your leadership approach?
You've rightly said, the National Crime Agency's many partners are replicated across the world, between 140 and 170 National Crime Agency officers deployed across the world at any particular time. And that actually was an interesting leadership challenge, because I'd been used to running a geographic police force where, on a good day, and it certainly didn't happen that often, but if you needed to, you could get round the organisation in 1 or 2 days. Actually, you can't do that in the agency. So how do you reach out to inspire and motivate and feel connected to those who are working abroad but still work for you? And certainly when I arrived, the technology wasn't as good as it now is. Thank goodness we managed to improve it, because I don't know how we'd have deployed through the pandemic. So in my first couple of years in the agency, I made a programme of visiting people in different countries. You're never going to get to them all. But for the last 2 years, we just weren't able to do that because of the pandemic. So that's the first thing. You have to think of different ways that don't rely on the personal interaction that you might be used to, the use of technology, the use of the written word, but finding a way to be accessible through all of that, so it's not done to people, but done with people. I think the other challenge is about time. One of the hard things in most senior leadership positions is everybody wants a bit of you, and everybody thinks the bit they need of you is the most important. So trying to balance your diary, and I had an amazing PA in the National Crime Agency. In fact, I've worked with many brilliant people who've kept my life in order. But the demands of Whitehall versus the demands of your organisation, one day in Belfast, one day in Scotland. Actually, that's a hard thing to do at the same time as making sure that you're adding value and just not on the road all the time. So those are the two big things, I think, is how do you balance your time between the people you directly lead and other organisations, and what styles do you use to engage with people that you don't directly see or can't directly access easily?
And as you say, different people feel that what they want is the priority. In your world, it isn't just a matter of evaluating yourself what priority you need to give to it. They're pretty serious issues that they're dealing with. And so how do you manage? You're only one human being. Great support is good news. But how do you manage that priority setting in terms of your leadership?
Well, the priorities for the National Crime Agency are actually set by the Home Secretary. The agency is directly accountable to the Home Secretary. And we had a very engaged process with the civil servants and the ministerial team every year to decide what the things were that we thought were the priority based on the intelligence picture, and then we'd agree what we were going to focus on. I think there's a challenge in strategic leadership, which is how do you balance the need to be looking ahead 5 and 10 years and making sure your organisation is fit for purpose, with the ability to dip right down into the points of detail where there might be risk. And that really matters in an organisation like the agency. I mean, as you say, when you're dealing with organised immigration crime or child abuse, or even some of the cyber offences, sometimes you do have to dip into the detail, and therefore the ability to be strategic all the time isn't there. So probably the best example I could give you of that is during the pandemic. There was a threat to the NHS, a cyber threat.
Yes, I remember.
And we had to we had to make the decision about, do you go public, and what does that mean for whether people feel comfortable attending hospitals. We made the decision not to go public, but that could have been heavily criticised had something gone wrong at a later date. And you have to take risky operational decisions about what tactics to deploy to try and identify the perpetrators, and some amazing work by the experts in the agency and partner organisations led to us identifying the offender in that case. But it's a really good example of how are you building the right capabilities for the future so that you can look at people like that who may be seeking to target the UK at the same time as recognising on one individual operation you're having to make risky decisions.
And the emphasis must change from time to time.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, I would imagine at the moment cyber is a big threat to us. And you talk about, you know, having to make those decisions and whether to go public with them or not. Those big strategic decisions have quite wide implications. How have you kind of reconciled yourself with having to make those kind of leadership decisions on behalf of other people?
When you're making those sort of decisions, sometimes they need to be made pretty quickly. Sometimes there's a bit of time to talk to other people about them. My personal perspective is I never think one person on their own knows all the right answers. So I think the more you can build a leadership approach which enables people to tell you, no matter their rank or grade, exactly what they think, the more information you have to make the best decisions that you possibly can. But you have to recognise that you are ultimately accountable, and at some point, in some way, someone may tell you that they think you got it wrong. And of course, people who judge you after the event have often got more information, they've certainly had more time, they might have been able to take the view that you got it wrong in a committee with lots of papers and having seen how the media have reacted or how the public have reacted. But the reality is the UK needs public servants who are prepared to take some of the most difficult jobs in the most difficult scenarios and make difficult choices. And I feel entirely privileged to have been in that position.
And you're working through people on the ground who are doing these tricky operations. How do you manage your leadership through those people? You know, because we talk in leadership theory, we talk about distributed leadership, shared leadership, multiplicity of leadership. Does that occur in those events, or are you the
You can't be. You can't be. I mean, whether it be in the National Crime Agency or every one of the police forces in England and Wales, every single minute of every single day, police officers and NCA officers are having to make judgments, you know, whether to carry on with a surveillance operation, whether to deploy firearms, whether to intervene in a child abuse situation, how long to observe certain behaviours before taking action. I couldn't make all of those decisions, and so how do you do it? Well, one, you try and train people appropriately. I think you try and set a culture for an organisation that talks about the extent of people's decision making, and of course the policing and law enforcement is highly regulated in this country, so that, you know, there are some things that can only be done by certain ranks of people and with certain authorities through courts and other people. But you cannot be a public sector leader and think all the decisions have to come to you, because actually that's just not in the public interest. So you have to be confident in a much more distributed model of leadership and accept that sometimes people will get things wrong.
So there must be a high level of trust in the people that are working for you and for them in you, in the decisions that you make. It's
certainly a two-way relationship. And yes, it does have trust, but with trust you have to have systems and processes to check. You can't just devolve the responsibility, because in my view that isn't leadership. Actually, that's actually putting people often in the front line in very tricky positions. So they have to be confident that you are doing everything you can to make sure they are well trained, and that you'll look after their well-being, and they know who they can escalate to if they're concerned about a situation. But at the same time, they also need to know that you will take accountability on behalf of the organisation if things don't go quite as planned. Yeah.
So, having left relatively recently your role with the National Crime Agency, how, for you, looking back on that, do you evaluate your success, your effectiveness as a leader?
Yeah, so I think there are a few ways to talk about success. I spoke earlier about the two things that motivate me, serving the public and then servicing those I lead. So on serving the public, the agency monitors, publishes every year how much crime we disrupted, how many children we protected, how many people we arrested, how much drugs were seized, how many firearms were seized, how many cyber incidents were stopped and prevented. And I take huge and deep and personal pride in the work of the officers and staff of the agency and their partners. They did amazing things in the 6 years that I was, almost 6 years that I was there. And when I know that actually children are no longer being abused because people are in prison, there is no better motivation than that. So that there are stories based on real life, and those are backed up by figures. Yeah. So that's one way of measuring success. The other way, though, is about you and about your personal leadership. And I don't think you can be a strategic leader without being able to take a step back and saying, what did I do right and what did I do wrong? And if I were to do it again, what would I do differently? I really value the 360-degree appraisal process. Okay. I think it can be misused because I think you can give the appraisals to people that are going to say nice things about you, or that you have a sort of coercive relationship with, that they won't choose to tell you what they think. Yeah. But I think if you create the right culture and give it to a really good spread of people who work with you, alongside you, as stakeholders, as peers, you can get a really rounded view of where people think you add value and where you need to improve. So for me, that overlaid with the staff survey of the organisation that talks about how it feels to work in your organisation, and we saw improvements every year in the year that I was in the agency in that regard. That's how I judge my leadership success, I think.
I think there's still quite a bit of fear around doing a 360 appraisal because people are very wary about what they'll hear back. In feedback. How did you receive that feedback? What did it mean to you?
So the first thing you have to recognise is it's quite brave for people who are appraising you to do it. So you have to have thought beforehand how you're going to manage your reaction to it. And I can't speak for other people. I can only speak for me. But I have a tendency to over-focus on the things I'm not doing very well. So I will read a 360, and there tends to be a free text question at the end. So what does Lynne do well? What could she develop in? And then there's normally something about role modelling in some way. But I go straight to the what could she do? What could she do better? So I can learn that. And it was fascinating, actually. One of the things that I did that worked really well for me is I shared the whole 360 with my non-executive directors of the NCA board, right, and with my deputies, and I did them as two different bits of process. And when I shared my first 360 with my non-executive directors, I gave my interpretation of the results to them and what I thought I needed to do, and I asked them to play back to me whether they thought that I was reading it right. And the universal feedback was, you've said nothing to us, Lynne, about the things that the survey says that you're doing really well. So that's the first thing. Actually, you can't only focus on the things that people are telling you you're not doing so well, because if you do, actually it can feel like a negative process, and it isn't. Yes. It's a really positive thing. The other thing I've drawn from it is that different people see you in different ways in different scenarios, and we all know we adapt our leadership styles. But I don't think we always know how they are felt in different scenarios, where some organisations may have different cultures. So I don't think there's anything to be feared in them. I think if they were to be viewed by a sort of line manager as a sort of tool to beat you with, yes, in those circumstances, I think it would be a negative thing. But as a development opportunity to really hear how people are receiving your leadership, I think they're great.
And as you say, if you've got a group of non-executive directors who are there for the good of the organisation, I know there's a group that I work with at the moment, and I would completely trust them with, I don't have to do it 360, but I would completely trust them, because they have the best interests of the organisation at heart. But I can imagine that there would be some groups, you know, some boards where that would be quite a scary thing to do. And again, it's about that two-way trusting relationship.
Yes,
Is that
definitely,
fair?
yes.
So can you give us any stories about those successes when you could see your leadership being enacted through others, and some of the real successes that you encountered in your 6 years?
Yeah, my 6 years at the agency. So I'll talk about an internal one first, which some people watching this may turn off a bit because it's not as exciting as an operational one, but it was really important. When I arrived in the agency, in fact, even before I arrived, people were contacting me to talk about the pay differential between officers of the National Crime Agency and officers in policing. And it was leaving a real sense of lack of justice. It was causing us real challenges with recruitment. But actually, lots of senior people in the agency told me, it just is what it is, Lynne, you won't be able to change it. And there was no new pot of money, so we knew we'd have to make internal efficiencies if we were going to do anything different with money. But it took me saying, no, our people are telling us they don't feel valued. We can see from the indicators that actually we are not able to recruit certain groups of people because we're so different to other sectors. And we were able to build a case that went through our board and then was accepted through an independent pay review body. And now, I should say, in case anybody from the agency watches this, it's not job done. There is definitely more to do. But it made a massive difference to the most junior people in our organisation, and I felt really proud of that, and that has been reflected year on year through the staff survey. Equally, I don't want people to watch this and think they get paid a lot of money. They don't. They still get paid actually slightly less than police officers, but the percentage gap between what they used to get paid and what they now get paid is in a much better position, and that has left them feeling valued, which means they can deliver all the good operational jobs that they do. In terms of my leadership style operationally, probably the best example to talk about is what happened during the pandemic.
Right.
Probably the hardest time in my professional career, because what we were seeing was normal serious and organised crime. People wanting to deal drugs and firearms was continuing. We had to look at a completely different method of operating because there was no way that you weren't going to be able to run the agency and protect the public through the pandemic. And then we also saw criminals looking to operate in different ways to catch people out during the pandemic. So we saw paedophiles moving online because they knew more children were going to be at home. We saw fraudsters procuring PPE and creating click-through messages on people's phones to steal their money. So we had to, almost on the top of the head of a pin, really tilt the agency to a different way of working. You know, officers allocated their own surveillance cars to take home so they could keep them COVID secure. Brilliant work by our technical teams. At that stage, we'd only just started rollout of online devices that people could click into, and they doubled to, well, in fact, so the whole of the organisation could be online if we needed to, which literally overnight. So brilliant work by the technical teams. Huge decisions about some intelligence that was coming in from different partners, and actually just being able to say to policing, we know you are under a real stretch too, but actually we are now producing more packages than we ever have done, and we really need you to execute them because that's the way to protect the public through this period. So it's probably the most recent example.
That's a tricky time for everyone, but I think a lot of people just don't realise how much change your organisations like yours will have had to do to keep the rest of us safe.
Yes.
So thank you. Thank you for that. So I want to ask you now about the real challenges in leadership, the kind of stuff that would have kept you awake at night. What for you were those leadership challenges?
So I don't think in leadership you can afford to be scared, because I think if you do roles like the one that I've just taken and you are constantly scared, then you're never prepared to make the risky decisions. But neither can you be foolhardy. So you do need to be constantly aware of the risks that your organisation is holding, and they are manifold in a public sector organisation. So there are always, there will be now, even though I'm not cited on them, cases where the agency are conducting intelligence-led investigations where we know there could be a threat to life. And they will be making judgments about whether to deploy a firearms team, or whether just to warn the person whose life we think is at risk. There'll be operations running online where we think children may be being abused, and we'll be trying to identify both the children and the offenders so we can protect and safeguard the children, and arrest the perpetrators and put before court the full extent of their offending behaviour. So there is always significant risky decisions, and not all of those sat at my door. They sit at all levels in the organisation, but some of them did. And some of them would now if I were there. And those are the things that have to be the number one priority, because those are the things that can really impact members of the public. But there are other issues too that worry you, and you should be worried about, like if you think you've got people in the organisation who aren't behaving professionally, who could be corrupt. You worry about your technology estate. Is it going to be subject to a cyber attack, and how do you best protect your organisation through cyber security? So it's a constant balance between the risk to your own organisation and the people within it, but keeping going because of those operational cases that I can talk to.
No, that's fantastic. I really like what you said about not being too scared, but not being foolhardy either, and having that balance of understanding what you need to do and doing it. And did you feel that you were juggling? We talked earlier about the different stakeholders. Did you feel that you were juggling their priorities as well as having to make decisions in terms of your own priorities?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the things with serious and organised crime is it's very, very broad. We subdivided it into three big buckets of things. So, what I earlier described as more traditional serious and organised crime, so those who deal with drugs and those who supply firearms. And actually, policing really care about those sort of offences because they see the very real world impact, the connections between firearms and drugs and violence on the streets. So an understandable desire to focus on county lines and the pressure locally. The next bucket we would describe as those cases involving vulnerability, so modern slavery and human trafficking, child abuse, often unseen. But we estimated, was it last year? Last year in the strategic assessment that the National Crime Agency published, that between 550 and 800,000 people in the UK have a sexual interest in children. A huge number of people, and understandably, the voluntary sector, some of the service providers, they're really concerned about that. And then the last areas we would describe those who impact on the UK state, so hostile state actors, cybercrime, cyber-enabled crime, and illicit finance. And of course, that's come so much more to the fore with what we've seen recently with Russia and Ukraine, and actually understanding where the dirty money is in the UK. But actually, if I subdivide that, if you look at the fraud and cyberspace, that's GCHQ, it's the intelligence agencies, that's Serious Fraud Office, HMRC, your Cabinet Office fraud teams. It's a different subset of partners. So you're right to focus that different partners had different strategic priorities, but only and often sometimes on a subset of the agency's priorities. So maintaining confidence of all partners whilst recognising the agency had limited resources, as all public sector organisations do, and that we were having to tilt accordingly.
No, thank you for that. And we're used to, sadly, quite recently, about the things that have been going wrong in policing.
Yes.
And a number of key issues have been very public. But we know that that's a tiny minority of what's going on, and it happens in all organisations. It's obviously incredibly important in policing and other areas where we rely on you for our safety. But I'd like you to focus on what really shines out in the positive in terms of what you've observed in policing, UK policing, leadership. So what have been the really great things that you've observed in your time?
So I am immensely proud to have been a police officer and to have recently concluded some time in the National Crime Agency. Throughout my whole career, I have worked alongside some of the most can-do, energetic, positive people who will consistently put themselves in harm's way to protect the public. Their shifts are changed at immensely short notice with huge impact to their personal life. They turn out at scenes that the vast majority of the public would never want to see. But I don't think that can become an excuse for the poor behaviour. And I have, we don't need to list them all here, but there have been some events, the horrendous murder of Sarah Everard by a serving police officer was there are no words. I don't have the words to describe just how abhorrent that was. So there is no doubt that Policing UK, the Met, the National Crime Agency, other organisations need to work really hard to try and understand the people in their midst, and hopefully a murder is a very rare thing, but who could let them down. They can let them down by committing crimes, by selling the nation's secrets, by being terrorists at the one end of the spectrum, but also by being misogynistic or racist or homophobic or lazy or unprofessional. And I know that the good people in policing and law enforcement feel that as passionately as you and I do.
Yes.
And therefore the leadership challenge for policing is how to create the intelligence structures to root out those people, but at the same time give people in the organisation the confidence to come forward. But that's as much a leadership responsibility as it is for those on the front line.
Yeah, understood. And thank you for that. So my two pop culture questions, sort of. So what is the leadership myth that gets on your nerves the most, and how would you challenge it?
So I think as a country we're getting obsessed by the hero leader or the charismatic leader. And I think there are, I, like anyone, loves to be in a room with a leader who is funny and engaging and makes you feel warm and that you'd follow them. But I also think it's a bit dangerous. And all leaders need some element of charisma, I think, to be able to do it. But actually, if you only say the charismatic and the hero leader is going to succeed, then you lose the introverts. You lose the thoughtful, you lose those who might just look at problems in a slightly different way. So that's probably my biggie, I think. Let's get the balance right between the heroes amongst us and those who've got charisma with those who might just think a bit differently.
Oh, that's lovely, thank you. I'm all for supporting the introvert. So my final question, who's your past or present leadership hero? Who do you think enacts leadership really well?
So that, I think, is a really fascinating question, because I'm not a fan of the charismatic or the hero leader. Actually, I never pick one person.
Okay.
I can look across my career and see lots of people that I have learned a lot from. So Sir David Phillips, who was Chief of Kent, he was actually a bit of a charismatic hero. He was a great historian and told many funny stories. But he fundamentally redesigned how intelligence was approached in policing. But he did, lots of my success in my career is because he encouraged me way back when, in a time when it probably wasn't trendy. So there are people like Sir David. But then there are some different and quieter people too. So there is Grace Ononiwu. She is a Director of Legal Service at the Crown Prosecution Service. She is an amazing lawyer. She's a brilliant partner, but she's also a very inspirational woman in the progress that she's made in her personal career. Then I think, well, who else? And I think of people like Lady Justice Hallett. Yep. So Heather Hallett, an amazing legal professional about to do the COVID public inquiry, a really tricky bit of work, but a very solid, thoughtful public servant that puts the public in the heart of all her decision making. And then lastly, somebody that wouldn't be known to people watching this, but somebody called Reshad Alaudin. He was the non-executive director of National Crime Agency. He's been a magistrate, but just a very thoughtful, quiet man who for many years has supported policing behind the scenes in trying to get it right. And he would always be the one on the National Crime Agency board that would say, I'm not sure I've actually heard you mention the public enough in your discussions today. So just a wide range of people who I think for me show the spectrum of different leadership styles and how it all come together to make a difference.
I like the way that leadership by influence, that quiet leadership by influence, can be as powerful as the charismatic leader that's out there in front of the camera or wherever doing their stuff. It's as good to be in the background. Lynne, I'm hugely grateful for that. Thank you so much. I'm sure that the folks that are going to watch this are going to really learn lots from your answers. So thank you very much indeed.
No, you're very welcome.